Good morning, everyone. Hello. Pastor George here with today's episode of a new thing. If I look particularly tired, it's because I was watching the Mets game last night, and that added years to my, or that took away, I should say, years to my life. But hey, we won, so who cares? It's all worth it, right? So today we're going to be talking about the Pope. Pope Francis's comments a few weeks ago. I was in Egypt at the time, but like even over there, just with the kind of the circles that I run in or the algorithm that I get fed on my news and YouTube and social media stuff, like everything popped off about Pope Francis's comments. And so I'm actually not so much going to criticize or at least like go after the Pope specifically. I'm more going to use this as a launching point to talk about something that I think is important because it's so pervasive in our society. And I want to talk maybe about a positive way of understanding it, but also to kind of hold firmly to what we believe. I mean, I've criticized this type of thinking a lot, but I wanted to kind of do, I don't know if a deep dive is a right word because I'm not going to do a huge literature review or anything like that. Mostly just kind of reiterate previous teaching. So firstly, as always, I want to start us off with some Bible passages. So this is what it is. So I have three for us. So John 14, verses 5 through 6. Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So then we have, after that, we have Romans 2, 12 through 16. Paul writes in that letter, he says, "All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares." And then in Acts 17, this is Paul's sermon in Athens. So this is what he says. This is what Luke writing says, I guess you could say. What he recalls from Paul's sermon. He says, "Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, 'People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, "To an unknown God." So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said. We are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." All right, so we have three things there, and all of this I brought up in response to what happened while I was gone. So you'll see this happened September 12th. Pope Francis was doing a big tour of East Asia, went to Indonesia, several other places. I think he ended in Singapore. And while he was there, he talked to a group of young people that were it says here at the Catholic Junior College. And so he gave a speech, and you can see some of that here, right? Francis presided over a gathering of young people from the religious traditions that are present in Singapore. Mosques, Buddhist temples, and Christian churches stand side by side among the city's iconic skyscrapers. He talked to them, and it seems like he went off script. It says Francis ditched his speech and urged the youth to take risks, even if it means making mistakes. But he came back to the topic at hand to make his main point about the need of people of different faiths to engage in constructive dialogue rather than insist on the righteousness of their particular beliefs. Again, this is the AP, the Associated Press reading of the situation. One of the things I found is that secular news institutions do not always do a good job of representing everything, sometimes putting their own spin. I mean, of course, we all do this, right? But this are their own spin on things. That might be how they're interpreting it. I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. But one of the important things that I think is here is where it says, where Pope Francis continues, and it says, this is the quote that sent everyone off the bridge. It says, all religions are a path to arrive at God. They are like different languages to arrive there, but God is a God for all. And then he flew away, and then this made up a huge thing. I mean, like, it was actually kind of hard for me to find just a normal news source talking about this, because, I mean, I can just show you, right? So, if I do that, and you go to this, you'll see that it's tons of Catholic things, right? Like, you have the South China Morning Post, you have that, but, like, all of these, like, I have the Commonweal one up here, but you have the Catholic World Report, you have the Crux taking on the Catholic Pulse, Catholic Answers, America Magazine is a Catholic magazine, Catholic Outlook, Where Peter Is. Anytime you see anything about Peter, you know that's a Catholic thing. The Catholic, literally called the Catholic Thing, is one of the pillar. You have the Christian Post, you have the New York Times right here, but this is an opinion piece, right? Catholic News Agency, Catholic World Report, Where Peter Is, Church Leaders, Catholic Vote, Vatican News, Detroit Catholic, 1 Peter 5. So you see other like Christian stuff like Answers in Genesis and Christian Post and maybe other things, Crosswalk. That might be Catholic, Focus on the Family. It's not. All that's to say is that is you just have this interreligious gathering. You can see him kind of talking to people dressed in different clothes. Probably reveals I'm not from Singapore, so I can't tell you. I do know something about Singapore, though, is that it's very, very interreligious. There's lots of, it's actually mandated by law that they take it very seriously there, but they also have some, Singapore is very different than the United States in the fact that they have some serious free speech laws that kind of keep Christians from evangelizing and things like that. So while they do respect a lot of religions, it's very much like in the tradition of, we do this because, we don't want anyone troubling the peace, sort of thing. And Singapore is very much about that. Not that that is inherently wrong, but certainly has its drawbacks, right? But anyway, Pope Francis is there, and he says that, right? He says this path to God, or arrive at God. Something you're going to note is there's going to be different ways of translating this, and that's because I believe he was speaking in Italian when he was there. And so there's different translations of that, but you're going to notice that the translation kind of affects this. So the AP gives what is the original translation. So this is Commonweal magazine that goes on to kind of talk about some stuff. So it says here, during his recent visit to Singapore, Pope Francis went further than any of his predecessors in recognizing the value of non-Christian traditions. All religions are paths to God. Notice that's a different translation, right? First it was arrive at God and paths to God. We're going to look at a little graphic that someone put together here just so you can kind of see the difference, which I think is helpful. There's only one God, and religions are like languages, paths to reach God. Some Sikh, some Muslim, some Hindu, some Christian. Some prominent conservatives have reacted with scorn Writing in First Things, Archbishop Emeritus of Philadelphia, Charles, this is something with French names. Is it Caput or is it Chaput? I'll just say Chaput. Charles Chaput reminded the Pope that Christians hold that Jesus alone is the path to God. On X, so that's formerly Twitter for anyone who doesn't know, former Bishop Joseph Strickland went a step further. Please pray for Pope Francis to clearly state that Jesus Christ is the only way. Joseph Strickland was actually, by Pope Francis, removed from his episcopate because he's kind of been a very strong voice against Francis's papacy or whatever. It might be tempting for Francis's defenders to dismiss his remarks as off-script and therefore not authoritative. That would be a mistake. The Pope's affirmation of non-Christian religions, while generous, is not contrary to official Catholic teaching. It is not a slip of a tongue. Since the start of his pontificate, Francis has approached other traditions with a remarkable spirit of openness and humility, all while insisting on Jesus as the way and the truth and the life. And so you're going to see, I mean, like, so you're going to see, if you look this up, right, you're going to see First Things, you're going to see other groups in the Catholic faith, like other parts of it, defend Pope Francis and say that this is okay. You're going to see people, like they just quoted, take big shots at him. Now, of course, I am outside of this tradition, right? I'm not a Catholic, but I think what Pope Francis says here, I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think really, if you want my honest take on Pope Francis, I think he's kind of a hippie. But he's not, I think, the massive changer of Catholic doctrine. In fact, he hasn't actually changed any Catholic doctrine since he's been there. I remember when he was elected back when I was in college, a lot of people thought he was going to do all sorts of things to, modernize the church or whatever, and he really hasn't. But he certainly has caused a lot of Catholic apologists hypertension by the things that he's been saying here. And he still does that. And I think that's because he's of a generation that's on the older side now, but grew up kind of a flower power type of thing. I know he's from Argentina, not the United States, but it seemed to kind of be a general trend in the world around that time period. And so he tends to have a very open view towards lots of things, or a more a generous view towards a lot of things. Sometimes, which is good. Like, we can't just say that's always bad. It's not bad to be generous to people. But we also want to be very clear about teaching. And I think it's that balance that many of us struggle with. And I think Francis, just being a man, struggles like all of us with that. So I'm not here to take pot shots at the Pope. I'm mostly using this as a launching point to talk about inclusivism. So inclusivism will go to my non-friends, not friends of the podcast, the Unitarian Universalist Church. But just as a lesson in this, so inclusivism is this idea that that the Christian view can be inclusive of other religious traditions and other truth claims. And I want to be clear that some of that is possible, but the general idea of inclusivism is that other people can be saved through other means than Jesus. Right, and I want to point out that this is not the same as universalism, although these two are often conflated. I mean, by Unitarian Universalists themselves, they're conflated. But universalism is the idea that God saves everyone, which is different than inclusivism, because in universalism, everyone is still being saved through Christ, right? But in inclusivism, people are kind of saved by their own merit in these other traditions. And I'll point out, one of the scriptures I read is one of those ones that I see them cite to try and prove this point, and I'll just, show that I disagree with that by looking at it. But, like, you can basically get the idea of this, right? So Unitarian Universalism is a non-Christian church that comes Christian heresy out of the 1800s. They're Unitarian, which means that they denied the Trinity. Right, so automatically that puts you outside of the Christian faith. And then they're Universalist. Now, I'm not going to say if you're a Universalist, you're not a Christian. Some people go that far. I don't think that that's true. I think there have been theologians who I disagree with. I'm not a Universalist, but who are Christian, even though they're wrong on that point. as I see it, right? So, but inclusivism is the idea that other religions are equally kind of paths to God, and you see Pope Francis do this. One of the things I wanted to show you is just the translations of this. So this is Mike Winger, and he just talks about this in his video when he's responding to it. But I liked his little graphic here because you can see that it's been edited or changed by the Vatican in order to soften the language. And I don't know if they're necessarily doing this to be duplicitous. I think this is mostly an in-house problem because they're trying not to make all the more conservative Catholics upset. So you'll notice that this is two parts, right? Because every religion is a way to arrive at God. That's what the Associated Press translates it as. And then it goes on, there's only one God and each of us is a language, so to speak, in order to arrive at God. And then you'll see that they changed it to trying to reach God and try to express ways. So it doesn't make it as strong, right? It makes it more conditional. And then they kind of change it again. But paths is different than arriving at God, right? It's kind of just, it's, again, a little softer language. So Mike was just kind of calling that out. It is a little bit, you know, hiding the 8 ball, but whatever. So you can see here, right, this is their symbol. It's the little lamp with the flame. And then you have all the different world religious symbols all around here. Of course, I'm sure you recognize Christianity and Judaism and Islam. But of course, you have the wheel, the Dharma wheel, which is a Buddhist symbol. You have the Om symbol for the Hindus. You even have this atheist symbol. You have the humanist symbol. You have the world, the feminist symbols, the New Age symbol, and the Taoist symbol. So you can see here that it's there. And this is basically what they say, right? They say Jewish and Christian teachings call us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Words and deeds of prophetic men and women challenge us to confront evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Wisdom from other world religions inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. Humanist teachings counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and science. Direct experiences of mystery, wonder, and beauty renew the spirit and keep us open to the forces that create and uphold life. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. And so you can see that, like, this is basically inclusivism taken to its highest order. So kind of my 2-point thing is going to be just responding in general to inclusivism, and then the difference between inclusivism and common grace, which I think people often swap out and fail to recognize. And so we're going to talk about that. So we're just going to look at our Bible verses here. So first of all, the difficulty for any inclusivist is the fact that the Bible is very exclusive in its claims a lot of the time, and Jesus especially is, right? Because some people will say, well, if Paul says it, it's not the same thing as Jesus says, if Jesus says it. The fact of the matter is that Jesus has very strong statements about who he is, and who, if you know him, then you know God. And there's no stronger place than that than John 14, where Jesus says to Thomas, he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So if you want to know what the difference between universalism and inclusivism is, that universalists would say, yes, this is true, but everyone is saved because God is merciful, right? Inclusivists don't really have a great response to this. They'll point to stuff like Romans 2:12, which we'll look at, or 12 through 16, which we'll look at in a little bit. But I think, you know, putting aside the universalist stuff, maybe I'll spend another day on that. But this is a very strong claim from Jesus, right? I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You're not going to get much as strong a statement as that in the Gospels. There are a lot of other ones very similar, but I mean, that right there is very clear that from Jesus's perspective, from the early Christian perspective, the only way to get to God is through Christ. There are no other ways. It is just through knowing Christ that's how you're going to get there. Now, there are parts of the New Testament that seem to maybe wrinkle that a little bit, if, I would argue, are read without context. So the most famous one, or one of the ones that people will appeal to kind of support a broader view, is Romans 2:12 through 16. So this is Paul writing, and this is kind of still part of his introductory piece of Romans. And he's telling people not to judge one another, not to hold kind of like a position of prominence and be like, oh, you know, you're such a sinner or whatever. So Paul goes on to say, all who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law, for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. So here Paul is mentioning Gentiles, so these are people who do not have the law of Moses. And so he's making a case here that even they, right, have the law written on their hearts, and that's what causes their conscience to make them, you know, prick them in certain ways and think about God and things like that. And so what people will say, inclusivists will say, like, look, Paul says that Gentiles here do things required by the law and therefore can be declared righteous, right? Because Paul in 13 says it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Now, I think that this kind of is a little misses the point, right? Because we see earlier, right, just in verse 12, here is all who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law, right? So everyone sins, and you're going to perish and be judged by the law. And this is important for Paul's overall point in Romans, which is that you cannot be saved through the law. You have to turn to Jesus, right? There's a big thing here because this is why Paul is going to attack lots of different groups, right? He's going to go on to point out that the Jews, it's important, right, that it's not just that you're doing things, it's because you know, you say, oh, they shouldn't do these things, but you still do bad things, right? And this is a really powerful statement. A person is not a Jew who is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God, right? So he turns it on an inward thing. And so he says that no one is righteous, right? This is the overall point of this whole part of the opening of Romans, right? Is that no one is righteous, everyone sins, therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. So reading all this in context, again, right, this is not, they didn't have chapters back in the day. Everything that Paul says here in Romans 12 through 16 is modifying the overall point that Gentiles, right, if anything, this points out how exclusive it is, right, that even though you guys are outside and you know what is right, you guys still fail to do it. And you're still going to be judged for that. And this is a standard that's held to Jews as well, right? That's Paul's point. Jews and Gentiles stand condemned by the law. How can we be saved? Through Jesus Christ. Right? So stuff like this is really important. Now, here's the interesting thing. So this is wrong, right? You know, this is a wrong way of viewing it, right? I think that this is wrong, not only in the sense that it's just factually wrong from a biblical perspective, right? And so if you're going to claim that you're following Jewish and Christian teachings and praise those, you're cherry picking them, and you can't just say that everything's the same. But I also think this is factually wrong just from a religious study standpoint, right? Because you're just equating all of these things into what you want them to be, rather than taking, you know, Buddhism at what it's teaching, and Taoism at what it's teaching, and Christianity at what it is teaching. Now, can we then do we then say that all of the things that other religions teach are inherently wrong because they're not of the faith? No, right? And this is like where some people just want to say yes, right? It's an easy answer. You can just say yes, everything they teach is wrong, but that's not true. And that's not even true from a biblical perspective, right? Is the overall truth claim of Buddhism incorrect? Yes. But does everything Buddhism is everything it teaches wrong? No, right? I mean, I actually think that Buddhism is one of the world religions that points out that people who are not Christian understand that the world is fundamentally broken, right? That's an important part of Buddhism, right? That there is kind of this brokenness in the world that other religions don't really acknowledge. Like Islam doesn't really acknowledge that, for example. It kind of does, but not in the same serious way that Christianity and kind of Buddhism recognize that. Now, that truth that Buddhism proclaims, right, does that mean that it's right completely and it's another path to God? No, right? And this is the line you have to walk where we can talk about common grace or the law written on the heart that Paul is referencing, and inclusivism, right? That it's not just you can praise something that's right about something while at the same time pointing out how it's wrong. And there's no one better to point this out to us than Paul in his sermon in Athens. So the Areopagus is this hill that's right across from the Acropolis. Today it's just a bunch of rocks, but back then it was like a more serious place where you would have seen people debating and different philosophers talking about things. And Paul goes up there and he begins to give his kind of version of this, and he's doing exactly what everyone around him is doing. And he gives this sermon to the people of Athens. And it actually might be worth reading kind of this completely in context, right? So he starts, he sees that the city is full of idols. So he goes to the synagogue, he reasons with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks. Those would have been Greek people who had not converted to Judaism but still worshipped the God of the Jews. And he's debating with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. They're going back and forth, and so they take him to the Areopagus so he can teach them. And he stands up and he gives the sermon that I read earlier. Now, like, it's, it's called a sermon, and there might have been more to it. Maybe Luke shortens it, but this is basically his claim. You'll notice that when he says, you've been raising from the dead, and this is the thing that sets people off. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again." After that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, as well as also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So it's not very successful, and the reason is I've talked about this in sermons before. The Greeks had a low view of the body, and so when they hear Paul talking about the body, the resurrection of the body, a lot of people write that off because they don't like to hear that. They think it's base and wrong. But anyway, Paul here does a great job of threading this needle for us. So if you want to know how it's possible, here it is. So Paul points out, he begins by pointing out what? He begins by pointing out that the Athenians are very religious, which they were. Everyone in the ancient world was. They have a bunch of temples and shrines, and he points out that they have a shrine to the unknown God. This was very common because you never wanted to make a god angry by not offering them sacrifice. So lots of towns would have temples or altars to unknown gods, so you could offer sacrifice to keep them appeased, even if you're not, honoring them the same way you would Athena, who you have a big temple for, right? You just don't want to make a mad. So he says, he takes this thing that they're declaring, that they understand that there is divine things that they don't understand. He says, all right, I'm going to take that. I'm going to use that as my hook, right? So he takes that and he says, I'm going to declare this unknown God to you. And then he says that this is the God who made the heavens and the earth, doesn't live in temples, is not into idols. You'll notice here that he doesn't mention Christ, which is interesting. Now, he doesn't, of course, he does, but he doesn't as explicitly as maybe we would think, or things like that, right? But he's basically saying God is calling to all of us to follow him. And And then he calls out this idea of idols, right? So, he's going to come judge the world. And so he's calling to us. And you'll notice that one of the ways he backs up his claim is he says, "For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." Now, Paul quotes two people there, and neither of those are biblical quotes, right? You would think that he would do that, but what is he doing? He's speaking to Greeks, right? And Paul was very well educated. Greek was, if not his very first language, an early language for him, I would imagine. I wouldn't be surprised if that was what Paul's preferred language to communicate was. He clearly is well educated in his letters. This is evident. The Greek he uses is pretty sophisticated, and as well as here you can see he's quoting from Greek philosophers, right? The footnotes here in the NIV will say this is found in the philosopher Epimenides and from the Cilician Stoic philosopher Aratus, right? Both these are Greek. Crete and Cilicia are Greek-speaking regions of the world at this time period, and so he's quoting non-Christian sources to point to truths about God. And this is why we can talk about stuff like common grace. Common grace is the idea that all human beings, by God, right, have been given blessings by him. You can see this just kind of in the idea of in the Bible where it says the rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? So these are material blessings, right? Because we believe that God gives everything, right? So a Buddhist who is gathering crops in Thailand is given those as a blessing by God, even if he's not recognizing who's giving it to him, right? That is a common grace sort of thing, and that's because God loves his creation and his people. Now, does that mean that everything that person does or says is true? No, of course not. But it's clear here that Paul is drawing on this idea, and you can see this just in Romans, right? You can see this tie in right with what he says up here, the idea that the law is written on the heart. So there's going to be takes or beliefs that other people have that are going to be completely in line with what God is teaching, and that's not based on their own intelligence or merit or whatever else, right? But because that's part of the law that God has written on the heart. So these two Greek philosophers say what is true, not because they are super smart and just as following them is just as true as following Jesus. It's just because they're talking about the truths that God has written in the world that we can affirm. Paul's not going to then say now everything that they taught and said is in line with Christianity, but he's just pointing out that even among the Greeks, right, there's an understanding that points to Christ. And really, that's what we can do, right? You can be exclusive and still hold to that truth, and not have to become an inclusivist and just say, oh yeah, all religions are equally true, which is, you can't really say that and then treat all religions with kind of the same dignity. What I've found that tends to happen, especially in the West, is we like to say, oh yeah, all religions are true. And you'll be like, oh, how are they true? Well, they mimic Christianity, right? So you're still claiming that Buddhism is only true because it has things teaching similar to Christianity, right? This idea of love or whatever, which is not as powerful in a lot of these world traditions or other religions as it is in Christianity. And you're holding them by that standard instead of like, it would be like a Buddhist basically saying, oh yeah, Christianity teaches like the idea of dharma and karma, right? And it would be like, no, it doesn't, right? Like you might be reading into things, but it's really not, like we're not teaching that sort of thing, and that's completely outside of our tradition. And instead of debating or acknowledging difference and debating about that, it kind of smooths things over. Which is why, what the Pope said, I disagree with, but I don't think it's just a Pope thing. I think he's just echoing really an idea that became in vogue in the middle of the 20th century and remains in vogue in a lot of the parts of the West today. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I hope you guys found that interesting and gives you something to think about. I will see all of you on Sunday for worship, and I look forward to that. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Peace out.